Hello again to another edition of the M65 Podcast. Today I have Matthew Dowst as guest, and he is a PowerShell expert and work as automation architect with 20 years experience in IT. And also he writes the book, the Procedural Automation with PowerShell. And he also is a community builder. You find the PowerShell Weekly and also the podcast, so YouTube uh, channel. So yeah, check it out. You find all the links in the podcast description. So yeah, check it out. So welcome, Matthew.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So yeah, then let's direct deep dive into the topic. And my first question is, so I work a little bit with PowerShell, but not so deep. And there are people say it's a developer tool. I say it's an admin tool, or is it something else?
So that's a great question. It's both essentially. That's the great thing about PowerShell. Like if you actually look at the description of PowerShell from Microsoft, it lists itself as an admin tool and a workflow automation tool. So that you can do simple standard command line admin type requests, but you can also build full fledged enterprise ready automations using it.
Mm, awesome. And what have well, what have you pulled into the using PowerShell if you started with the topic?
So for me, I started in PowerShell around the System
Mhm.
Center suite. A lot around, you know, um, monitoring and observability, and then uh, working in like the ITIL space with the help desk. Essentially making anything that's repeatable, scriptable, right, and then uh, building out from there into full fledged automation platforms running you know majority on PowerShell.
And yeah, it's I think it's I'll say it's like a scripting tool, but I think just it's more than beyond this in PowerShell. So how how did you use it, or what will you say is PowerShell good for? So
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I always get the question from people. Well, can I do this? It's like, well, yes. The answer is always going to be yes. It just depends on how much time and how much money you have, right? But seriously, it's we talk about going in and running like a simple command of like get you know mg graph user, right? But there's so much that you could build around that, especially with PowerShell being object oriented, right? A great example, uh, you know, being that we have automations that we run at my company that go out and they talk to Graph, but then they also go back down and talk to Active Directory at the same time, and then go talk to Exchange Online or the Exchange Hybrid server, those type of things. And it's being able to kind of bounce around to those different items in one, essential click of the button, or execution of a script, and then have it be able to make determinations based upon what's returned to it. Right. So that's a big part of what I try to kind of evangelize is make your scripts adaptable. Right there, you build the logic into them so that you can create a function to go do something like create a user or pull down sign in logs or those type of things, right? But then you can link those together with logic, whether you're using loops or if statements or switches or whatever you have in your script. But use those little blocks and then build those together, and then you can make some pretty great and powerful things, right? Especially if you can then bring data into it as well.
it sounds so awesome. And I think a little bit, in the last years, uh, Microsoft 365 has matured, and is there how have the role of PowerShell changed in this time?
So a big thing in the last year has really been the graph modules coming into PowerShell. So that has really helped to kind of define exactly what was in there. Before, it was really separated where you had, the SharePoint team had their commands, and the Azure AD, or now Entra ID, had their own commands, and nothing was centered, nothing was, really clean. And 90% of the time when I had to deal with anything in along those lines, I just ended up writing directly to Graph, just using a web request, using a REST method. But understand that that's not something that your everyday person is going to want to have to deal with, right? When they're not going to have to deal with paging and looping and timeouts and all those type of things, right? So by introducing the Graph modules, they've really helped to standardize exactly what is happening across the landscape. Really think they they took a pretty big cue from the PNP folks in getting a really standard set kind of across the entire ecosystem, making it a lot simpler. You know, as long as you still have all the same versions of the modules installed, because that's a whole other different story. But
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, last time I have talked to I don't know what this was the Microsoft Graph user group, and they say, yeah, PowerShell is just becoming a wrapper. So, what did you think?
I mean, it always has been a wrapper, right? So whether it's a wrapper for making SDK calls or making a wrapper for graph calls, those type of things, you know it's a pretty good wrapper. You get defined parameters. And 'cause, I mean, nothing's worse than looking at that graph documentation or any documentation and just trying to guess exactly what it is that they want in there, right? So with the PowerShell, you get the defined parameters and things like that. Obviously, with that comes certain, you know, certain things where you can't quite get as maybe defined as you would like to be. But you're probably hitting a good 90 to 95% of use cases out there.
Yeah. And how do you balance PowerShell versus direct API usage?
I mean, I so it's funny. We actually just we just had this conversation on my team. Um, I look at it. I I approach it two different ways. One is if I have control of the environment, I'm going to use the modules where possible. Right? It makes it just simpler for people to understand. Anybody who's familiar with the modules can then go back in and look at those. If something changes, you can update the modules and every, for the most part, right? But you're gonna have your documentation on breaking changes and all those type of things. If it's something that I'm deploying out, I don't really have as much control over, like where it goes. Something I'm delivering. At those points, I tend to kind of lean more towards the API. That way, I can be very much in control of like which version it's calling and things like that. It But it does make the long-term upkeep of it a lot more difficult, right? Because now I'm having to pay attention to API versions all throughout, these scripts, and, knowing when ones are gonna, you know, get ended of life, or they, have breaking changes and things like that. So it makes it a little more difficult to monitor and maintain. But from a standpoint of being able to really have tight control over exactly what that's doing, in a static type environment.
And actually, I think we have all this new. I don't know. Okay, actually, it's Copilot, but we have also local tools like Power Automate, and I think it's replaced a lot of PowerShell use cases, or yeah. I
Yeah.
work
I've kind of maybe had a little bit of the opposite. I'm actually working right now on a project to I'm I'm trying to clean up my backlog, essentially. I have a massive backlog, and, I've put that into Copilot and M365, but the DevOps things that they have built in there aren't really good, and then, they can't do the things that I was looking to do. For example, I wanted to get a work item and then see across, 4 different repos what potential files that would be touching and what that would be affecting, and then be able to write my, acceptance criteria and risk criteria and stuff based upon that. So I wrote a PowerShell Azure function that goes and pulls that data for me, and then was able to click that um, into the M365 Copilot, and then kind of build my own function tools into that. So, at a point, it's like, the PowerShell is always going to do exactly what you tell it to do, right? There was no way I was ever going to build a PowerShell tool to go through and look at my backlog and tell me what I needed to know, right? But it can get that data so that I can make that determination, or something else can make that determination.
and Microsoft have no Copilot for PowerShell or I'm wrong.
No, they had one at one point that they tried putting it in, but I think they're just sticking with, the VS Code and GitHub Copilot.
But there are well, what's something PowerShell can do today what GUI still can't?
I mean, really, um, consistency and scale, right? So, that's a big part of it. If you go and you look at the GUI, um, it's great for, kind of like one-off changes and things like that. But, once you're trying to do something, across multiple regions or multiple areas and things like that, it's gonna get ugly quick. It's kind of the same thing as I mentioned earlier. I'm working right now on cleaning up my backlog. And, I had all sorts of things in all different states, and, some were groomed, some weren't, but, they didn't have so I just wrote a quick PowerShell, said, "Hey, reset all these things back to 1," right? And, then I can go through, and as I'm going through my list manually in the GUI, I'm able to go there and do that, but it would have taken me hours to just click through every single item. I mean, I'm talking there's like 900 items in there, right? There's no way I would have clicked through and been able to even keep track of anything of that scale, without some sort of, you know, automated way to go through and determine exactly what I have going through there. It is, kind of same thing on, when I was going in and looking at, okay, when's the last time this item was changed? And it said, well, here's your last change date. I was like, okay, well, that change was just related to me moving the item around, right? When you move something around in Azure DevOps, it just assigns this random number to it. So I was like, okay, well, I really want to know when the last time it was meaningfully changed. So I was able to use PowerShell to go and look at the history and say, okay, I don't care about this change, this type of change. I don't care, when if a tag was added to it. I want to know when a description was added, when a comment was made, when acceptance criteria was written. And I was able to get that data loaded into a spreadsheet, and then quickly make a determination on, okay, this hasn't been touched in 4 years, it's going away now, right? Whereas there was no way for me to actually be able to do that through the GUI without clicking on each individual work item, clicking on the history on it, and then scrolling down and trying to find the last meaningful change on it.
And I use it PowerShell only for administrative work, but when you use PowerShell, is there any hidden cost? I come from data, and there are a lot of hidden costs in Microsoft. Is there any hidden cost, or is there something people have to look at when they think about, I think, financial ops?
Yeah, I mean, you can run PowerShell on your machine. It's just the cost of operating, right? There's nothing to that. Um, Microsoft does have the Azure Automation, which allows you to run scripts in directly in Azure or on-prem in a with a hybrid worker, which is great because you can, cross-platform stuff from a single pane of glass type of things. But the run cost on that is infinitesimal. I mean, we have ones that run thousands of operations, and I think the most I've ever seen it hit was like $10.
Mm,
Uh, it's pretty cheap,
yeah,
more or less.
yeah, yeah, okay. I think $10 is it's a price for our enterprise solutions that it's really okay for Microsoft environments. I think you don't have call the CFO for this
Yeah.
normally. Yeah, but when you get advice to future admins, will they need more or less PowerShell, and why?
More. Uh,
More.
so yeah, I mean, as they're kind of saying, the the clickers you know are kind of going away, right? So with whether it's AI or whether it's a shell or what have you on the kind of the days of going through and clicking things are coming to an end. So you kind of see, even if you have your co-pilots going out and doing things, right? How much control do you really want to give it versus telling it, okay, hey, give me a script that does this, and then you can go back and you can look at it, you can understand it, and kind of see exactly what it's going to do before clicking that fire button and having it go off and just do things. So
So
it's good, in the realm of AI. I think having the ability to look at it before it fires, right? And knowing exactly what it's gonna do versus what it's gonna tell you that it's gonna do is gonna be a big value add.
this is awesome. Um, and I think a little bit about governance and reporting. Um, and there's a question: how do you use PowerShell for visibility and reporting across tenants?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So, we use it a lot at my company. So we do Azure management for customers where we go and we manage their Azure, and we're able to use PowerShell to gather data and monitor things that uh, just don't exist inside of Azure or inside of M365 by default, or at least are not reasonable to obtain. A great example is external shares in SharePoint and OneDrive and things like that. If you've ever looked in the Azure Cloud apps, the previously the MCAS um, Defender, whatever it's named this week. But the reporting on it, like if you share a site with somebody externally, right, you can go and look at that report. It's going to come back and it's going to tell you that every single file on that site is shared externally, which, yes, technically it is, but I don't need to know that the favcon is, that's not really telling me what has been shared and to who it's been shared with and to what level. Right. So we were able to use PowerShell to go and actually look at those objects that get returned and say, okay, it's being assigned a permission item, and then we have it walk up the list and say, okay, well, this was shared at the folder level, or this was shared at the library level, or this entire site was shared, and those type of things, and then giving a report. These reports come in with like about 1% of the actual number of things because you're just looking at exactly what was shared. Somebody right clicked on this folder and said share this, and that becomes one item instead of the 1,500 sub files and folders and things that are underneath of it.
And yeah, you work, I think, in your company with a lot of clients. And have you? You don't have to say the names of the clients, but can you share in one or two examples where PowerShell save massive time or prevent major issues?
Yeah, great. So one really great one that we had a couple years back was when the that Log4j issue came out, and there was a security vulnerability in the Log4j. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's basically it's a kind of a package add-on that is in a ton of different applications, and it gets packaged inside of that application. So it becomes very difficult. You can't send a update and say, update log4j. You have to go and determine, all of these different applications, whether or not they're using it. And but there was things like DLLs or you know, files on Linux servers and things like that to help you be able to identify if an application was using log4j. So wrote a PowerShell script that one, the first thing it does is it goes and searches the machine and looks for any instances of log4j. Right. So it searches the file, searches the registry, searches the memory, all those type of things to determine, okay, is log4j on this machine? Great. That really, made it a lot easier to be able to determine if it was on there. But then taking that a step further, we said, "Hey, go look at Azure. Go look at every single virtual machine and Azure Arc machine, and then run this script against them, and then come back with a consolidated report of every single machine in my environment that has, the potential for having Log4j on it." And, even took that script even further, and it's actually out on my GitHub if anybody wants a copy of it. But it goes through and it turns on the VMs that are turned off, checks them, and it turns them back off. Right. And it all runs in parallel so that you're not sitting there waiting for each machine to run individually. And you're not having to log into every single machine. You are cooking off one script and it's going through and it's finding every single thing in your environment that could potentially have that vulnerability that you need to remediate.
Yeah. I think there was, I think Shakespeare has asked the question, automate everything or automate nothing.
Yeah, I automate all the things, but the I always do say, it doesn't matter, how great of a programmer or coder or, you know, automation expert you are, a bad process is a bad process. If you automate it, it's just a faster bad process. So, it's always about, walking that fine line of, should we automate this? Is always a kind of the first question I think that people should ask.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Cool. This is awesome. I think I am more experts like you say. I'm a script kiddie. What separates a basic scripter from someone truly advanced in PowerShell?
Uh, I mean, I think anybody is, could be at any level. So let's say if I understand how the low code backside of PowerShell works, it's going to be the same as somebody who is able to write a PowerShell script. I think the big thing is learning those repeatable patterns, things like that. So avoiding writing the same thing over and over and over again. Right. So uh, instead of having four different calls to that do the same thing inside of your function or inside of your script, right? Build it into a function, and then just call that function instead of having to repeat all those lines and those type of things. Um, it it's funny that every single computer science class you ever take, they'll tell you the same thing. It's like, oh well, it makes it so much easier because when you have to change it, you don't have to change it in one place. But the big thing to understand, and I think that kind of gets lost in that is also remembering where you're calling that from. All right, so understanding the flow that you have going in there, because if I make a change to it, well, how's that gonna affect the other times that it's called, right? And those type of things. So it's really it's not so much a skill as much as more of a thought process that I try to um, help instill. Whether it's my writing or my blogs or whatever I'm doing. I try to really emphasize on the thought process behind it. Right. So I really kind of try to get a good idea of what it's doing, what it's going to do, and then how do we execute that before I ever you know, click, you know, the first letter or whatever inside of VS Code.
And yeah, this is cool for a short break before I ask my last question. My last questions. So you find Matthew's links all in also his blog in the show notes. And yeah, my next question is I think I'm from the data side, and we have this wonderful Microsoft learning stuff, and we have this gold standard, and they say, okay, it must be safe, repeatable, and scalable. Uh, how do you think, yeah, design PowerShell that's matched these three criteria?
Yeah, I mean, exact same way, right? So, you're always looking for scalability and maintainability are the two biggest things. And one of the I come from I got lucky on my background started out in infrastructure, right? Then I worked for the company that I work for. We do infrastructure, but we also do custom app dev. So over the years, as I've worked more and more, with in a developer type role, I've been able to learn from those folks and from the data folks as well too. At the same time, of hey, what's the best way to go through and get this data, or be able to determine this and those type of things. So you know, really asking the questions, knowing where to get data from, when does it make sense to have PowerShell do something versus when it makes sense to have something else do it. If I'm calling Azure Data Explorer, right? Am I just going to call a table and get everything back, or am I going to write a query that's going to return exactly um, what I want? Right. So going through, kind of making a determination of, when does it need to be built into the, documentation, or when does it need to be built into the script versus when can I get that from, an external force or source? Yes, would be better than force, but
Yeah, it's the record time is the force, so we have the Star Wars day. Okay, I'm more Star Trek than you. And yeah, okay, let us get to a hard topic. So, um, what are common mistakes people make when automating Microsoft 365 or Azure with PowerShell?
uh, so I think probably the biggest mistake that I see a lot is not having the ability to restart your automation. Uh, so, the classic example of creating a user, say creating a user in Entra, right? So the first thing that you want to do is you want to create the user account and then, set a bunch of attributes, maybe assign it to a group, right? But what happens if something goes wrong setting the attributes and then you need to restart from the beginning, right? So being able to build in a check into your own processes to say, oh, well, the account already exists. So now I'm going to go and now I'm just going to automatically skip to step two and then be able to write that. And then at the same time, being able to identify when something should end versus when it should um, continue on. So, for example, if it goes and creates the user and then fails to set the manager attribute. Well, do I really need to stop everything else from processing because it failed to do that? Probably not. Right. I can just record that error and then move on. Right. Where a lot of times what you'll see is you'll see a script that'll say, create new user. And in that one call they're doing, they're writing every single attribute that exists in there versus having it say, okay, create the new user with the very bare minimum of what is required to create it. And then in your next step, assign each attribute. And you could, maybe even go so far as to assign them one at a time via a loop so that if one of them fails, your entire thing is not going to fail. Right. And then if, you need to restart it, setting an attribute again, you don't really need to check for that because that's not going to cause an issue. But if you keep creating an account over and over again, then it will. Same thing with the groups, looking at it logically, where, if you actually try to add a user to a group, they already exist, it throws an error. Right. So knowing how to capture those errors and then don't just put, you know, error action silent and assume that it failed because of that, right? Actually capture that error and say, okay, did it fail because the group doesn't exist, or did it fail because, the person was already a member of it, right? And then make a determination on whether when you want to actually throw that error message.
Yeah. The errors is also a nice topic. So in where I work, I see often, yeah, we know Microsoft rename something and do often updates and yeah, and it's cool. I'm happy with this, but sometimes yeah, I don't get the information. They have updated like the Graph API or something or the ETL pipelines. So, how do you test scripts in an environment or environments or tenants that are constantly changing?
Yeah. So, that's one of the most difficult things that I have to deal with, in my job, because I can write all the pester tests that I want to go through and, like, test the logic of my code and then, fake and mock all the, graph calls, but that doesn't tell me if something in graph changed, right? So, I need to actually be able to replay, uh, graph calls, and it's actually something I've been working on. Hopefully, I'll get it out here soon within the next couple of months of building. Right now, I just have it as a bunch of one-off scripts, but I've built using the PS Web and PS Node to create my own API calls that act like graph, right? So that I can actually determine, how
That's a
yeah, how's it gonna behave under certain situations? At the same time, too, at some point, like, I have development tenants that I have to go write graph scripts that go and set the tenant as I expect it to be, and then test my script against it as well. So, it's never simple, but, once you kinda get it built, now I have it all in pipelines, right? So, I have ones for testing, Azure Bicep deployments and things that, uh, I'm using PowerShell to essentially wipe out the environment afterward and setting it back to the level that you would, encounter at a customer, right? So what you would if you run into things with, like, providers not being enabled and turned on and those type of things, being able to determine that. So, doing those captured states and then writing that back has been a challenge, to say the least.
okay. Well, this uh, and when you have bring this out, you have give me information so I can share it with the
Yeah, yeah,
others.
definitely.
Cool. And yeah, let's talk a little bit about the future. Um, where is PowerShell heading in the Microsoft ecosystem over the next years? What did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see, it's not going anywhere. That's for sure. They still have a strong investment in it. It's tied very closely now with the .NET releases and staying up and staying current with that. Um, the stuff that we saw recently released with the Microsoft Graph, that shows that they're putting a big investment into it out there. Even though the Azure team kind of leans towards the CLI sometimes, it's, they basically become kind of one of the same. Microsoft's made the commitment that um, in Azure and in M365, that anything that you can do through the GUI, you should also be able to do through PowerShell.
And think you? Will everything eventually move to Graph API first or not?
There's always a place for the commandlets and the wrappers and the things like that, right? So that there's not the need to, as I mentioned, writing to the API, you have to go, I gotta open up my web browser, I gotta look up the commands, I gotta build out the JSON and all those type of things versus, if I need to, get a security alert from M365, right? I can literally type in, get dash MG security alert. And if I don't know how that's supposed to be, I throw get help at the front of it and it's gonna pop back right there in that console and tell me exactly how to use it. So it makes things much quicker, much a lot more seamless, especially with the administration and the quick things that you want to be able to do, configurations, those type of things.
And we have so many. I think we have the Microsoft have a lot of upcoming people. They like to learn administration, and when you give them an advice to learn PowerShell today, what should they do to be relevant after their study or make their certification? What's a tip to for new admins?
I mean, I would say that try to do anything that you did in the portal, you know, through PowerShell. All right. So whether that's going through and enabling admin roles or MFA or creating a SharePoint site or whatever it is that you're doing, if you can do that through uh, PowerShell, then save it. Not now you've done that. So the next time you have to go through and create a site, hey, you know what? I've already have my template here for this. All right, so that when I create a conditional access policy, here's the things that I need to enable. I don't need to have two screens open side by side and you know trying to copy things over, right? I have my template there. I've saved it and I can reuse that anytime I need to do that same process again.
Awesome. And now we come to my favorite part, uh, and it's the hot take part. Uh, I ask you 5 questions, and you are ending it. Yeah. Um, if you are managing Microsoft 365 without PowerShell, sorry, you are doing it.
Wrong.
Yeah, I think this is the right answer. But bye.
Sorry, was that? Sorry, I missed that last question.
If you are managing Microsoft 365 without PowerShell, you are doing it
Yeah.
wrong, and why?
Why? Because you're making your job harder, essentially. As I'm just mentioned, uh, do it once. Don't do it over and over again. Right? I always say that PowerShell made my ADHD a superpower because I can never do something more than 3 times in a row without going insane. So I script it, but that has allowed me to, you know, just be able to complete things so much quicker in the future, right? So it may take you an extra minute or two now to do it, but you're going to save yourself so much time down the road.
And yeah, my next question is Power Automate is not replacing PowerShell. It's
Uh, it's supplements it really, or complements it. There's a lot of things that Power Automate can do that makes it pretty fun and easy to kind of just jump in there and start doing things. Definitely when it comes to your standard uh, M365 Office and those type of things. Uh, it's great, but when you really need to get down dirty into things, right? So PowerShell can supplement that. Whether that's it doesn't necessarily need to replace it either, right? You can create an Azure function that does a portion of your Power Automate for you.
and GUI based automation is fine for beep, and but it's completely breaks it.
Uh, it's fine for individual use, right? It works great when, you know, when you have something that you do repeatedly and that you need to get done. When you want to do something at an enterprise scale, uh, the GUIs tend to kind of break down, right? Because you want a lot more control, you want a lot more logging, you want a lot more customization than you're going to get through a GUI tool.
It and most organizations don't have a tooling problem, they have a
So what was that one again?
most organizations don't have a tooling problem, they have a
uh, sprawl problem.
yeah, I'm so with you. I'm so with you. It sprawl, uh, yeah. And, my last question is Microsoft Graph will not kill PowerShell, will it make it more?
If anything, yeah, it's gonna make it even more powerful, right? So anything that you can do through an API, PowerShell could do.
Yeah.
So as more things become that have APIs and don't require all these, very specific DLLs like back in the old days of SharePoint, right? Where you had to have which version of SharePoint you were using and that admin console on there to be able to, it was, the same thing with like the old System Center days where you had each individual System Center product and you had to have the management console installed to be able to do that. Right now with APIs, it becomes open and it becomes so much more that you can do with a lot less. As I mentioned, like with Azure Automation, right? Those jobs run in Azure. I don't have to have that on my machine. It has built-in schedulers. It has built-in credential objects and variables and all those type of things directly in there. And if I'm calling APIs, then it just runs straight in Azure. And I don't have to worry about it. So the more things that move to an API type level like that, the more powerful PowerShell will become.
Yeah, awesome. Oh, this was so great, to talk with you, and, yeah, I think the last words for the audience, I give it to you.
Uh, yeah, I mean, don't be afraid to automate. Don't be afraid to get in there and start playing around and seeing what there is. And always remember, you can just type in get dash help anywhere in PowerShell and what what command you're trying to do, and it will tell you.
Awesome.